is something that economists would say this is a market, market for adaptive reuse where you get a supply and demand. This is as simple as that. With that you get the basic Econ 101 course and we can proceed, because what I'm going just to show is in this example of Kigali and of adaptive reuse of heritage or building for artistic activities, basically we will start to identify the resources or the assets, which is important, what of course is documenting and what the students did marvelously, but I had maybe some kind of comment on that, and then we will going to see the use, the outcomes, or what is it for, how can we provide some kind of benefits, some kind of outcomes in order to convince maybe decision makers. And I will have a small conclusion that will be a kind of introduction also to the contribution of Amin, saying that this market and the way that we process using assets to produce, to generate some kind of benefit, well, needs maybe 2 or 3 advice or 2 advisors or 2 or 3 comments. So let's start with this. Let's start with this identification of cultural capital of Kigali, and you see that I use a kind of terminology that you may have encountered in the past. Capital, you probably know what capital is, but you think probably about financial capital, a bundle of money and banknotes. This is nothing to do with that. You get financial capital, but you get also human capital, about the skills of people, about the human resources, and you get also social capital, as Bourdieu introduced it many years ago. Well, there is also this kind of terminology about the cultural capital made of different kinds of cultural assets, and to identify this cultural capital should come over with a kind of consistent, ensemble of resources that you can use for some macroeconomic purpose. These are, of course, part of this cultural capital. You get here a lot of assets. You recognize probably most of them because we discussed about this this morning. I've had also something that maybe is a kind of special there, because I just brought a very nice tree here, and there is no reason why this is not a natural asset, being part, of enjoying the place, enjoying the city, and being part of this cultural capital in a kind of definition. You get also here a place where you get people working, people enjoying, people having there is a small places for food, for maybe some traditions, for kind of, intangible, we would say, which can also be part of capital. So this definition of cultural capital, to me, I would say, I don't care about the definition. You decide about what you can bring into this cultural capital, and I realize from our experience that in different countries around the world, you get very different perception about what is the cultural capital or what are the cultural assets, relevant for what we discuss. So this is just a kind of, non-exhaustive list of everything that you can bring to a capital. You get, of course, tangible assets, monument, buildings, everything. You get natural assets, green areas, parks. You get intangible assets, following the definition of UNESCO, for example, including traditions, including food, including knowledge, including languages, and so on. And you get other cultural assets that you may decide to bring in addition to your cultural capital. So you realize that when we take this kind of glossary here, you realize how big can be the cultural capital. It's almost everything in a city, because it's part of assets, of people, of skills of people, human assets, it's natural assets, cultural assets, and you realize when you are in Kigali, or you get this kind of interconnection between everything. Tangible assets versus people versus natural assets and everything. So this is where I refer to what Berend introduced this morning about the historic urban landscape, because what I'm just telling you there about this kind of connectivity between everything that is worthwhile is basically the recommendation by UNESCO about historic urban landscape. So this is one of the definition, not one of the definition Article 8 of the recommendation by UNESCO. You can read it by yourself. It's not always easy to understand. I agree, but I worked and I used to know the people who wrote this recommendation at that time, and it's something that basically I realized this morning by listening to the students that they get, you know, this historic urban landscape. Maybe they didn't know exactly, you know, the kind of terms that they used here, but basically when they spoke about connection between the people, when they spoke about a kind of journey, you know, through the everyday, when they speak about kind of distance views, kind of perspective that you get by walkability, by enjoying going along the sidewalk and looking at trees and that kind of thing. Everything there is about historic urban landscape, actually, because these are layers of different kind of assets. So you get a layer of tangible, of monuments, you get a layer of natural assets, you get a layer of human skills, of knowledge, and everything together gives this kind of what I call cultural capital, what UNESCO will call an historic urban landscape. And this is an example, because in the last few years I had the opportunity to test this historic urban landscape and to make them, to map, actually, to do a mapping of historic urban landscape. Of course, this is what basically has been done here in Kigali, and that we saw some result this morning. It's maybe a little bit more sophisticated when you take all the list, you know, of kind of assets that I just suggested to you. Don't go in detail. I'm not going to explain this kind of map. This is a map with maybe 100 or several hundreds of assets put on the same map. And these different kind of layers gives, at the end of the day, some kind of information about the place, the hot cultural spot, you know, in the cities, or people have a perception of that, or you can use this kind of cultural assets to provide some either cultural activities or some economic or social benefits or everywhere. So it's rather a complex system, and this was done for the city of Rijeka. This is a nice city on the beach of Croatia, which is going to be cultural capital of Europe, European cultural capital in 2020. So what we got here is the cultural capital of a cultural capital. I don't know if Hervé is still here, because for his next stand-up comedy show, this is something interesting. Why is Marrakesh cultural capital? Because it has cultural capital. But you know, it helps if a lot of economists are in the room, which is maybe not but this is, you know, and in French it's also so this historic urban landscape or cultural capital should be integrated in any master plan somewhere, because the master plan usually, you know, give a kind of zoning, give a kind of documenting of everything. This cultural the historic urban landscape is the opportunity to bring all the connections between everything, between the past, between the future, between people, between tangible assets and everything. And so this is one of the kind of suggestion that I have. If you revised actually the master plan from Kigali, is to go maybe a step further in documenting and the identification of the historic cultural landscape of Kigali. And I would be surprised, you know, to see some kind of red spot or places where you can get more, you know, intensive cultural activities. You see, where you get more creativity. Some kind of neighborhoods where you get more some artistic activities. This is very, very interesting to see this kind of mapping in some cities where you see of where things are happening. And this can help you in selecting the places, and this can help you, you know, to connect the tangible with the artistic activities. The number 2 is to say, okay, I get this cultural capital, but so what? How can I use this to provide some kind of benefit? So this is what we call the assessment of outcomes from the cultural capital, saying that the cultural capital gives rise, this is a definition of a capital, gives rise to a flow of outcomes and values over time that may contribute to sustainable development. So I should underline the 2 last words and start backwards. Sustainable development, to me, is of course the objective that we try to have for anything that we do here in Kigali, being the master plan or being the project by students this morning. They need to keep in mind what at the end of the day we want is to have a city which is safe, which is resilient, which is inclusive, which is sustainable, which is exactly, you know, as you know, the goal 11 of the Millennium Development Goals. There is a long story about these Millennium Development Goals, by the way, why culture is not a goal among the 17 goals. When I have time, I will explain you why the reason of that is a bit long, if you have some time. But anyway, culture is not a Millennium Development Goals, but culture is everywhere else, you know, behind these Millennium Development Goals, and especially in the city objective. So this is a kind of easy thing to say, to tell, okay, how sustainable is my project? So you take what? You take a case of adaptive reuse of cultural assets. You take, for example, the 4 pillars of sustainability, by the way, environmental, economic, social, plus cultural, of course, and you take some criteria. I just take a very simple, easy example with 1 criteria for each pillar. You see, environmentally, if the heritage or the old buildings get an energy consumption of heritage building which is better than a new building, if there is accessibility and congestion related to heritage which is better than building a tower, you know, bringing some kind of traffic issues there. If you get some social impact, if you get some economic impact, creating jobs and income, as you know, if you get some cultural impact, basically you get the 4 pillars and you get something which is sustainable. So this kind of criteria, if you want some criteria, I'm going to send you a lot of literature, because you get a list of, on one hand, 50 criteria. I know other lists, you know, where you get 200 criteria. I wouldn't care about the number of criteria. The important thing is that you address the different issues at the same time. So when you make your project sustainable, this is what I would say to the students this morning, is to test what they do if at the end there is something sustainable. This is an example that I used to make with my students, with the students where I teach at the KU Leuven in Belgium, in Master of Conservation. They get a church in Ghent, which is no more in use, and they get 4 scenarios about changing this church as a community center, food market, museum, scientific library. What they do is to take a multi-criteria analysis based on 4 different pillars: environmental, economic, cultural, and social. And these are the 4 scenarios. And you see immediately, you know, how the 4 pillars are not covered by this scenario. So you check the best scenarios, but mostly this is something that can rank the scenarios, but that can provide a feedback on improving, you know, your scenarios by, you know, changing something that will make it more sustainable and more convincing. The economic benefits, because this is what's at stake here. If you get sustainability, you create some benefit and some values. Speaking about the economic benefit, again, you get here a very large, very broad literature about all the, you know, outcomes, about tourism, about real estate, about attracting new businesses, attracting inhabitants, attracting investors, and so on. The key figure that I would like to consider when we look at, you know, what kind of outcomes is produced by cultural activities and adaptive reuse activities is to look at the stakeholders. So this is also something that maybe this morning we're missing by lack of time by the students, is to check about their project and to see who are the stakeholders. The stakeholders is not just the owner of the building. The stakeholder is not just the user of the building. The stakeholders are everyone who gets a stake in your project. And you realize that when you work on cultural projects, in a city, in an urban city, this number of stakeholders is huge. Everyone actually has a stake in the Belgian school or in the prison somehow in Kigali. So what do you need to do is to list the stakeholders and to see what is the stakes there. Who gets some benefits, who will maybe pay for something or get a kind of negative impact from the project, and then to start to negotiate, to bring people around the table, and to have a managerial process to get a solution. So let's assume that you could find this list of stakeholders. You would be surprised, you know. For the case of Kigali this morning, just over a piece of paper, I made the exercise of who's the stakeholders. I get 28 different groups of stakeholders. 28 different groups of stakeholders. The last line was future generations. Of course, these are stakeholders. You can say, how can they express their feeling? How they agree with the project or not? Well, there is a kind of some way, something that provide through surveys or through representatives of the future generation that can help in providing this kind of thing. So economic benefits, it's about basically address the sustainable issue, but for each of you, for each of group of people having a stake in the project and trying to measure the impact of that, and then weighting the different kind of impact that you get. Some people will benefit, some people won't, and this is the kind of balance that you do. As almost a conclusion, and almost a kind of teaser for the next part, I would have just a word about the process of adaptive reuse, you know, taking some kind of buildings or some kind of unoccupied buildings and bringing there a use for artists or for cultural activities is about how you do this process. And we are talking about cultural activities here. We are talking about artistic activities. And I won't say, I used to be dean of a business school, but I know that when we speak about culture, we speak about arts, like you speak the same if you speak about health issues or if you speak about other social issues, it's difficult just to apply, you know, the kind of classical or common business rules. So you need there to be really innovative in terms of governance, in terms of the decision-making process, but also in terms of finance. And this is something I think that we will see in the project of Amin in a moment. So the question here is, how can Kigali develop a kind of economy of commons? Commons or common goods are places that we share. So there is a time, you know, where we make an opposition between public ownership, private ownership. Public good, private good, you know, excludable good, non-excludable good. This is what I actually learned when I was in university, which was not yesterday, which was the day before, you know, or the week before. Today, this contradiction between public and private is no more really relevant. We speak about places that we share. We speak about collaborative economies. We speak about sharing economies. And this is what some expert calls the economy of commons. The economy of commons. And culture and the arts is an economy of commons because you share something. You share something, but at the same time, it's neither private nor public. Or if you want, it's at the same time private goods and public goods, or private goods with a public character, you see? And this kind of economy of commons is really mainstreaming these days with some kind, you know, Uber. Uber, of course, is a kind of economy of commons, but with a very important differences is that Uber capture all the value, privatize the value. So when we share the value, Facebook also, by the way, they capture all the data. They don't share the data. So if you really are in a system of economy of commons, this is something that to me is really consistent with the kind of cultural activities that we try to identify. And number two, about financial models, how can Kigali develop innovative ways of funding and financing projects? You have, of course, heard about crowdfunding, risk-sharing portfolio, public investment goods. So my last slides, or my last slides are just example of that. An economy of commons, you know this example, maybe about the Experience Line in New York, which is neither a private, neither a public activities. It's something that is, you know, it started from people making a kind of commitment and trying to save this place, and then they proceed, you know, to have a crowdfunding platform, and then after a while, the municipality of New York came on board on the project. This is something that we call a POPs, a privately owned public spaces. So it's a public spaces basically, but it's not really a public ownership. So you see that you can make this kind of distinction there. I get several examples here that I will go very fast, and that is part of a Horizon 22, a European project about circular economy and adaptive reuse. This is an example, for example, in Slovakia, about crowdsourced restoration of creating a spaces for business and social activities. So in each of these cases, it's neither a pure public thing, neither a pure private thing. It's always something that it's, you know, a kind of mixed thing. You get this example of Belgium, of a company who just take all the the kind of materials of the dismantling a building, and they recycle everything. So they take the window, they take the doors, they take everything, and they do a kind of recycling of that to a kind of catalog. And it's working very well. You get this example in the Netherlands about students' association who decide to make some kind of housing which is completely sustainable, meaning that it's completely circular. The water is recycled, everything, the energy is efficient. So these are small works which are really sustainable. And again, it's neither public, neither private. It's really a kind of mix. Example of innovative financial models is the fact that we can have at the same time a public investment fund there that attract some kind of private investment. How can private investors go into or join, you know, this kind of activities to finance urban heritage development fund? By the way that all the project is a portfolio of projects. So they don't finance just a museum or a place, a cultural places. They finance different kind of projects that you put together into a kind of portfolio. And the interaction of all the projects, that makes me think to cultural capital, historic urban landscape, all the connections between having there a school, having in the other street having a theater, having a kind of public or open space, having a parks, everything will create a multiplier. And this multiplier can be, the benefit of this multiplier can be captured by the city through fiscal mechanism, through real estate mechanism because of the land value that can capture by it. And the fact that you get this multiplier, you get at the same time, you know, private investor getting a return on investment, a kind of private return on investment, but at the same time, you get the public authorities being able to capture a kind of outcomes. So this is an example of how we work on this question of financial issues, but I think that my time is is not so. I will stay with an economy of commons, so I will share the rest of the time, and I will thank you very much for your attention. This is, by the way, the email where you can join me, and anyone who wants a kind of textbook like this, it's not a publication, so this is a textbook, so I can provide you with, to send you a kind of textbook that it's really open access about having an introduction on economics of heritage and adaptive use. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Christian. We'll get some time for Q&A after presentation. Just want to say a few words because I really appreciate your presentation. And what I personally found interesting is the way you started with introducing a few principles, such as the cultural capital, and then move on to cover the two sides of the coins, right? How do we not only fund it, but also how does it generate revenues, values, and outcomes? And to add on that, what I also found very interesting is the way you grounded that conversation, referring to what happened over the last days, right? And giving also feedback to the students and the work that they presented. So thank you very much for that. So now it's time for you, Amin. I hand it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Christian. Thank you, Modesta. I think it was good that Christian started. We discussed this at lunch, and I think just within a few minutes of talking, we realized that we're talking about pretty much the same things, but the order had to change. And I think what you just saw was the principle, but also the framework of how these kind of projects are implemented, and the global perspective from UN, from cities. So there is a framework that most people, most countries are using and are building on. And it was good that Christian built on that. So what I wanted to talk about is specifically to share some of the experiences in dealing with at least 3 models that I've been involved in this country. But also just to give you an idea of how I see if I was to make this project happen, as I believe we all want to, how I see this framework coming to life using some of the experiences I have here. So I want to build on that framework, but I contextualize it a little bit. To give you a bit of a background, for me, I like that the profile is one line. I think so. I'm a cultural entrepreneur, but behind that, that means about 80% of an artist. So my background is in art and design, but also 20% in business. So I tend to, everything starts from a cultural, from a big idea to then realization in the real world, in terms of how you deal with the legal framework, with the financial framework, with the funding framework for various projects. I run a company called Innovation Village, which is a partnership with the government of Rwanda to run the public library. It's one of the biggest cultural platforms in the country. We have about 10,000 people coming into the library every month. And if you actually see, a lot of the events that happen at the library are not owned by the library. So people, we are curators, we are hosts of different events, different projects and programs. And we've done we do about 100 events in a year, using the 4-floor platform and the public space. We designed the physical space. We found the structure, but we designed the experience, the programs, and then the curation and the whole coordination of how people actually register and do events, and then we help them in terms of promoting the events. So that's one framework that I'll come up in terms of what's the relationship between Innovation Village, government, and the different artists. The second entity that I want to talk about, it's the national park. So I'm the chairman of the national park Kagera, which is it's hectares of land that belongs to Rwanda, to the Rwandans, but it's fenced as a national park to separate the wildlife from agriculture, to also to protect both people, the villages across, as well as the wildlife. It's managed by different entities. I think one main entity is a partnership with African Parks. Then the main governing bodies run the development board, but there's also different funding agencies. People pay to enter the park. There are lodges. There are different levels of tiers in terms of business and activities. So that's one other entity that I think we can draw some experiences in terms of how national parks work. I wish I was involved in a museum because it would be closer, but I think the library is closer